Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this microfiche time capsule, we are looking back at the Biographical Encyclopedia, Volume 1, and this article is entitled Smith, John, the fifth presiding patriarch of the church. So, that is relevant because there were two presiding patriarchs named John Smith, and one was not a junior of the other. They were not even directly related. They were like great uncle and great nephew, yeah, if I remember correctly. But that means that since they weren't named after their fathers, neither one of them was a junior. And that basically means that we have two people who don't have any other name other than John Smith. It makes it very confusing of which is which, but the one we are talking about today was the uncle of Joseph Smith Jr. Now, we have actually talked about the other, who was the nephew of Joseph Smith Jr. He was Hiram Smith's oldest son. But this John Smith was the brother of Joseph Smith Sr. Yeah? And he's also called Uncle John. He was one of the presiding patriarchs. I'm not sure why they said fifth, because according to me it's fourth. But it looks like they had written down that Asahel Smith was a presiding patriarch. I will look deeper into that before we get to the presiding patriarchs, before we get there, but he wasn't actually on my list. But so I had counted John Smith as the fourth, but whatever. Not important. But basically we are filling in some gaps from the past, from Joseph Smith's presidency of the church. And it's a little embarrassing for me because for whatever reason, like it's written down, but I didn't write it down. I didn't write down that John Smith was in the first presidency until recently. I feel really silly about that, and like, why didn't I realize that? Apparently, I overlooked it. I apologize. I have remedied that, and I'm hoping that I don't overlook anyone else at any point. Yeah, and I will continue to revise things and make sure that it's as correct as I can possibly get it. So yeah, this is the final gap in the first presidency of Joseph Smith, except for Joseph Smith himself, who I am not discussing, as I have mentioned before, and that is because there is so much information about him, it would take me like 7 hours to do a decent job. Besides the fact that there are lots of articles on him, I don't feel the need to add to them. The information is out there. I am much more interested in people that most people aren't familiar with. Like, the least known it is, and the more information I have, the better I like it, yeah? So, in this case, I don't have tons of information about him. I do know that they called him Uncle John. And he was called as patriarch after the martyrdom. And at first, William Smith was called as patriarch, but that didn't end up working out. He was very arrogant about it and thought that it meant that he was the next leader of the church for some reason. I'm not sure why. Yeah, presiding patriarch doesn't lead the church, people. So they ended up having to release him. Anyway, so let's jump into the article. It's relatively short, but yeah, not to be confused with his great nephew, John Smith. With multiple people with the same name, it's very confusing. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And what's ironic also is that the other John Smith and he served as presiding patriarch back to back. So he served first and then his great nephew after him. So, yeah, that's confusing, and they're both named John Smith with no junior in sight, so here you go. So it was confusing. It was confusing at the time. I actually thought it was the same person for a long time until I finally figured out that they were two different people. But yeah, I realized it because he was presiding patriarch for too long. And yeah, and then I was like, that's too long. It was like from 1840 something until like 1910 or something like that. I'm like, how is that possible? And then I looked and it was two different people. Like, oh, That's how it was possible. Yeah, thank you. Figured it out. Anyway, so let's take a look at the article. Smith, John, the fifth presiding patriarch of the church, was born July 16th, 1781 in Derryfield, now Manchester, Rockingham County, New Hampshire. He was a son of Asahel and Mary Smith, formerly Mary Duty, and uncle to the prophet Joseph. In 1815, he married Clarissa Lyman, by whom he had 3 children. George Albert, also known as George A., he was the cousin of the prophet Joseph, and he was in the Quorum of the 12, and also his grandson, George Albert Smith, became president of the church. So, like, he also left quite a legacy, John Smith did. Yeah. Caroline, who I'm not familiar with, and John Lyman, also not familiar with him. The subject of Joseph Smith's mission was introduced to John Smith by his brother Joseph, the prophet's father, shocking, which resulted in his baptism January 9th, 1832, at a time of sickness near to death when the ice had to be cut to reach the water. Ugh. But from that time he gained health and strength, although he had been given up by the doctors to die of consumption. Consumption. Consumption was tuberculosis, which is a bacterial infection of the lungs, and it is horrific. Even today, you can still die of it. It's still possible. So the fact that he still lived through it is shocking. Like, that's incredible. Especially right after he got baptized in ice water. Like, congratulations, that's amazing. I don't know how you lived through it, but I'm glad you did. He was baptized and confirmed by his brother Joseph Smith Sr., and at the same time ordained an elder. Okay? In 1833, he moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where he, on June 3rd, 1831, was ordained a high priest. Okay, there's something wrong there. I think that's a typo. It's gotta be 37, right? Okay, the reason why it's wrong is because he was baptized in January 1832, and there's no way he was then ordained an elder in Kirtland. I don't even think they were in Kirtland yet. I think they didn't come till the next year. In 1831. Like, there's something wrong there. In 1833, he moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where he, on June 3rd, 1831... Did you go back in time, dude? No, you didn't. There's got to be something wrong there. He was ordained a high priest by Lyman White, and in 1838 to far west Caldwell County, Missouri, and thence to Adam-on-Diamond in Daviess County, where he presided over that branch of the church until expelled by the mob in 1839, and arrived in Illinois on the 28th of February that year. That was the longest sentence ever. Yeah, I will look up that other date. I am sure that it's wrong, because there's no way. Like, timeline doesn't make sense. So, yeah. I don't know exactly what year it was, but it had to be after he was baptized. So 1832 is the earliest it could be, and it looks like 1837 is the latest it could be, considering 1838 he'd already moved far west. So, somewhere in between, yeah. He located at Green Plains, 6 miles from Warsaw, where he put in a crop of corn, split rails, and performed much hard labor unsuited to his health and years, but obliged to be done for the support of his family. Ooh, did he suffer ill effects from that? In June, he moved to Commerce and Nauvoo, and on October 5th was appointed to preside over the saints in Iowa. On the 12th, he moved to Lee County to fulfill that mission. In October 1843, he moved to Macedonia, Hancock County, Illinois, having been appointed to preside over the saints in that place. He was ordained a patriarch January 10th, 1844, by Joseph the prophet. Oh, okay, so he was one of the patriarchs before he was called as the patriarch, yes? And in November of that year was driven by mobbers from Macedonia to Nauvoo, where he continued to administer patriarchal blessings to the joy of thousands until February 9th, 1846, when he was compelled by the mob violence of the free and sovereign state of Illinois to again leave his home and cross the Mississippi River with his family. Gosh. In search of a peaceful location, far off amid savages and deserts in the valleys of the mountains. After passing a dreary winter on the right bank of the Missouri at winter quarters, he again took up the weary ox train march on the 9th of June, 1847, and reached Great Salt Lake Valley September 23rd, where he presided over the church in the mountains until October 1848. Oh, interesting. Okay, so I was just thinking, 1847, so he was one of the first groups of people. He was in one of the first groups, not the first, because they reached Salt Lake in July 24th July 1847, but he reached there in September. But it looks like he wintered there, whereas Brigham Young returned to winter quarters for his family, and so he came the next year again. But until he came back, John Smith was in charge. Yeah, there weren't tons of people there, but it's like, well, you're in charge of this area, It makes sense. He was probably the highest ranking, person in the church at the time where he was, so that's interesting. January 1st, 1849, he was ordained Presiding Patriarch over the church under the hands of President Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball. He moved out of the fort onto his city lot in February 1849, and this was the only spot on which he had been privileged to cultivate a garden 2 years in succession during the last 23 years of his life. Wow, imagine moving so much. That's a lot. In addition to a vast amount of varied and efficient aid to thousands in the way of salvation, during his long and faithful ministry, he administered 5,560 patriarchal blessings, which were recorded in 7 large and closely written books, which are now at the historian's office. He died in Salt Lake City, May 23, 1854. He closed the arduous duties of a well-occupied probation, writes the editor of the Deseret News, and passed to a position of rest, where his works will nobly follow and honor him, and where he will continue his able counsels for the prosperity and welfare of Zion. Huh. Cool. They didn't say much about his life before he became a member of the church, though. He wasn't young. He was the age of Joseph Smith's father, so, around, I think he was even the older brother, if I'm not mistaken, so he was even a couple years older, where that would mean that he was, in his late 40s, and, geez, they don't mention anything that he did up until then? They really don't mention anything. I'm assuming he was a farmer, just like the Joseph Smith Sr. family was. But other than that, who knows? He could have done lots of things in that time, but apparently nothing worth writing down. I'm not sure. Maybe. I found that interesting, though, because the end of his life was then more eventful and faith-filled, so to speak, than the beginning of his life was. So, you never know. It's never too late to have something happen to you, that things can happen and things can change, and it's really, really amazing the things that can happen. Alrighty, let's go to Wikipedia and do some fact checking. This article is quite short. That's a little disappointing. I think it's even shorter than the one we just read. Alright. Whatever, at least we have a picture this time. So I'm glad there is a picture to put in the background. I'm not sure if there will be any others, but there's at least one. Alright, John Smith, July 16th, 1781 to May 23rd, 1854, known as Uncle John, was an early leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS Church. Smith was the younger brother, so Joseph Smith Sr. was older. Was the younger brother of Joseph Smith Sr., uncle of Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, father of George A. Smith, grandfather of John Henry Smith, and great-grandfather of George Albert Smith. There you go. He served as a member of the first presiding High Council in Kirtland, Ohio, as an assistant counselor in the first presidency under Joseph Smith, and as presiding patriarch under Brigham Young. He was succeeded as presiding patriarch by his great-nephew, who was also named John Smith. It was so confusing. So luckily they don't look anything alike. John Smith, the younger one, had a full beard. John Smith, Uncle John, apparently didn't. And it's very confusing, though. Smith served as president of the stake in Lee County, Iowa during the Nauvoo period. He was also the first president of the Salt Lake Stake. Really? They didn't mention that. I found that very interesting. The first stake in Utah Territory, and as such was the leader of the Latter-day Saints in Utah in the winter of 1847-48. Okay, so they made him president of Salt Lake Stake before there were really very many people there, yeah? They hadn't even really settled. They're like, hey, we're building houses and planting crops and stuff. John Smith, you want to be stake president, you know? But that makes sense. They said that he led the church at that time. Yeah, during that winter. Smith practiced plural marriage and fathered 4 children. They mentioned 3. Smith died at Salt Lake City and was buried at Salt Lake City Cemetery. Hang on. No, it says nothing about the children. Interesting, because they only mentioned 3 in the other article. Monument to 4 generations of a branch of the Smith family. Yeah. Further reading. Oh, there's a book from 2016 called Uncle of the Prophet, The Life and Achievement of John Smith. By Jeremy C. Schwendemann. Schwendemann? Something like that. Cool. That is really cool. Interesting. It says he is the only person to serve as a stake president after being a member of the First Presidency. Yeah, because he was First Presidency under Joseph Smith, yeah? And not, and then later he was released because Joseph Smith died. And then he became Presiding Patriarch and then stake president, where he was doing both at the same time. Cool. Looks like we got a second picture. That's awesome. Alright, so he was an assistant counselor in the First Presidency from September 3rd, 1837 to June 27th, 1844, which is the death of Joseph Smith, with Oliver Cowdery, Hiram Smith, Joseph Smith Sr., and Amasa Lyman. Yeah, I think that sounds right. Although Joseph Smith Sr. died in 1840, I believe. And so then he wasn't up there. But yeah. I find that really interesting. It's a little bit short, it's a little bit abbreviated, and like I said, it really doesn't mention much about like the time of life before this. I'm also going to Google real quick to see if I can find when he was ordained a high priest, because that date was wrong. Okay, cool. Yay, I found it. It's in the Joseph Smith papers. That's fantastic. It says June 1833. And there's another picture of him. That's not a very pretty picture of him. Like, he looks almost in pain, like he's suffering with something, like he has some sort of jaw problem. I wonder if he was missing a lot of teeth. Maybe. Interesting. Although that whole family had very long faces, so maybe it's just long face, you know. I mean, Joseph Smith sure did, and so did Hiram. So, interesting. I found that very interesting. I think it's absolutely fascinating, some of the people who were involved and some of their stories. And I'm glad to have been privileged enough to tell a few of the stories. And it's nice to have covered all of the First Presidency at this point. And I feel very privileged to be here and to be speaking to you about John Smith today. Anyway, I hope that you really are enjoying yourself as well. For the future, I have made up my mind. I am doing one more article from the First Presidency before we move on. One last one on James E. Faust. He being the final person who served in the First Presidency who is not still alive. Anyone else? The only few that are left are all still alive. We have Henry B. Eyring, Dieter F. Uchtdorf, Dallin H. Oakes, and Russell M. Nelson. So, yeah, we won't be speaking about them until after a time when what they are doing is finished, yes. I don't think it's fair to tell someone's story before they've finished it, yes. And besides the fact that I solidly prefer historical sources, I have found a few that are still historical without being quite as historical as the ones I've been using. And so we will be talking about James E. Faust next week. And then we are moving on to the Quorum of the 12, starting at the top with Thomas B. Marsh. So you can look forward to that. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy this series and on like the general authorities from the church. And if you did, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.